It's a question most history books never ask. But behind the rise of one of England's most powerful royal families lies a story that's dark, painful, and almost forgotten. Before there was King Henry VIII, before the break from the church, before the golden age of Queen Elizabeth I, there was a little girl named Margaret. She wasn't born into power. She didn't lead armies or wear a crown. But her decisions, her suffering, and her strength helped shape the world that followed. At just 12 years old, she was forced into marriage. At 13, she gave birth to the future king. The pain nearly killed her. The trauma never left. This is not just a story about kings and queens. It's a story about survival. About how a child, broken by the world, rose to control it from the shadows. You've heard the story of the Tudors, but you haven't heard this one. Stay with me until the end, and you'll uncover the hidden truth behind the dynasty that changed history, starting with the girl it almost destroyed. Margaret Beaufort was born into a world already stacked against her. She came from a noble family, the Beauforts. They were connected to royalty, but not quite royal. They were powerful, but also dangerous to the throne. That made Margaret valuable. And in medieval England, being valuable often meant being used. Her father died before she was even born. She never knew him. Her mother remarried quickly. Margaret was passed between homes, treated more like property than a child. She had land, money, and a name. That made her useful to powerful men. She was just a little girl, maybe 6 or 7, when they began to arrange her future. Not school. Not a childhood. A marriage. The first marriage plan fell through. But the second one stuck. At only 12 years old, Margaret was married to Edmund Tudor. He was a man in his 20s. She was still a child. She didn't have a choice. Why the rush? Power. The Wars of the Roses were breaking England in two. Families were fighting for the crown. The Tudors wanted to rise. Marrying Margaret gave them a chance. Her bloodline gave them a claim to the throne. That was all that mattered to them. No one cared how young she was. Soon after the wedding, Edmund took Margaret away. She was now a wife. And not long after, she was pregnant. Think about that. She was 13, carrying a child. Her body was too small, too weak. Giving birth could kill her, and it almost did. While she was still pregnant, Edmund died of the plague. Margaret was alone. She gave birth to her son, Henry, in a cold stone castle far from home. The pain was unbearable. Some say she screamed for hours. Others say she nearly died. She was just a girl, holding a newborn king. But the damage was done. The birth changed her body forever. She would never have another child. Some believe she couldn't. Others say she chose not to, afraid of going through that pain again. Either way, her life had changed. She wasn't just a girl anymore. She was a mother, a widow, and the guardian of a future dynasty. But here's the cruel part. Even after all she had suffered, they still took her child away. Henry Tudor was sent to live with others, powerful men who could protect him, or use him. Margaret didn't raise her son. She watched from a distance. 4 years. For most of his life. But she never let go. Not of him. And not of her plan. What makes Margaret's story so haunting isn't just the pain she endured. It's what she did with it. Most girls in her place would have disappeared. Married again. Lived quietly. Kept their heads down. But not Margaret. She began to study the game. The game of survival. The game of politics. The game of power. She watched the families at war. She learned who could be trusted and who couldn't. She stayed alive by being careful and smart and silent. She was playing the long game. And deep down, she believed something no one else dared to say out loud, that one day, her son would be king. It seems impossible. How could a girl, beaten down by the world, plan something so bold? But Margaret had something most people didn't. She had a reason. She had lived through hell. And if that pain meant something, if it led somewhere, it might all be worth it. So she waited. She watched. She moved her pieces quietly, while kings and armies clashed out in the open. Because the girl they thought was broken was far from finished. Margaret Beaufort had just turned 13. She was no longer a child, not in the eyes of the world. She was a widow and a mother. Edmund Tudor was dead. The plague had taken him in prison, leaving Margaret alone in a cold, unfamiliar land. She was pregnant, scared, and surrounded by strangers. There was no comfort, no protection. No one came to help. In January of 1457, she gave birth to her only son, Henry Tudor. He was born in Pembroke Castle in the middle of winter. Snow outside, stone walls, silence. It should have been a joyful moment, but Margaret could barely survive it. Her body was too young, too small for childbirth. The pain was nearly fatal. Some thought she wouldn't live through the night. Others whispered that she was cursed, that no girl so young should carry such a burden. But she lived, and so did the baby. The boy was weak at first, but he grew strong. Margaret named him Henry, after the king. She believed, somehow, that he was meant for something greater. But she would not raise him. Soon after his birth, he was taken from her. Men said it was for his safety. After all, England was at war. No child was safe, not even a noble one, especially not the son of Edmund Tudor, half-brother to King Henry VI. Margaret had no power to stop them. She watched her baby leave, wrapped in blankets, carried away by others. She had no voice in his future, just a mother's fear and a memory. It would be years before she saw him again. She was 13 years old, a widow, a mother, alone. The world moved quickly around her. She was married again to a man named Henry Stafford. It was a safer match, chosen to protect her. But it was not love. It was survival. She lived quietly for a while, obeyed the rules, kept her head down, but she never forgot her son. While kings fell and armies marched, Margaret watched from the shadows. The Wars of the Roses were raging. Two families, the Lancasters and the Yorks, were tearing the country apart. Her son had blood from both sides. That made him special and dangerous. The throne of England was no longer stable. Kings came and went. Battles were lost and won. No one could predict who would rule next. But Margaret had a plan. She stayed close to power, but not too close. She changed sides when she needed to. She made allies where she could. Every move was careful. Every step was planned. She wasn't fighting with swords or soldiers. She was fighting with silence and patience. And underneath it all, she waited for one thing, her son's return. Years passed. Henry Tudor grew up far away, in exile. He moved from house to house, always watched, always protected. He barely knew his mother, but Margaret knew everything about him. She sent letters. She asked questions. She paid spies to keep her informed. She tracked his movements like a general watches her army. Because Henry wasn't just her son. He was her chance. The crown of England was still in chaos. The York kings were strong, but not stable. And as long as Henry lived, there was always a threat to their rule. Margaret began to act more boldly. She reached out to people who hated the Yorks. She started forming secret alliances. She whispered her son's name into the ears of the right men. A storm was coming, and she was helping to build it. But few noticed. To the outside world, Margaret was just a noblewoman. Quiet, religious, polite. But inside, she was something else entirely. A strategist, a mother with a mission. A girl who had lost everything, her childhood, her freedom, her son, and turned her pain into power. What kind of woman does that? One who knows what it means to survive. One who knows how to wait. And one who is ready to change the course of history. England was bleeding. The Wars of the Roses had turned the country into a battlefield. Towns burned. Nobles switched sides. Kings rose and fell like the tides. For Margaret Beaufort, the chaos was personal. Her son, Henry Tudor, was still in exile. She hadn't seen him in years. She didn't know if he was safe, but she never stopped believing he was important. The throne was now in the hands of the Yorks. Edward IV ruled with strength, but his rise came with blood. He had crushed the Lancastrians, Margaret's side. Her world was shrinking. Her second husband, Henry Stafford, stayed loyal to the York king. Margaret followed him quietly, keeping herself out of trouble. But inside, she didn't forget who she was. And she didn't forget what had been taken from her. In 1471, things got worse. The Lancastrians lost again, this time badly. King Henry VI, once a symbol of peace, was murdered in the Tower of London. His son, Prince Edward, was killed in battle. The Lancastrian line was nearly wiped out. Now Margaret's son, Henry Tudor, was one of the last men alive with a real claim to the throne. But he was far away, across the sea in Brittany, and the Yorks were watching. If they caught him, they'd likely kill him. Margaret was stuck. She couldn't reach her son. She couldn't protect him. But she could still play the game. She watched, waited, and married again, this time to a man named Thomas Stanley. He was powerful, connected, deep inside the York court. But he was also cautious, always ready to switch sides if needed. Margaret used that. She knew how to survive. She didn't need to win every battle. She only needed to stay close to the pieces on the board. And then, something unexpected happened. King Edward IV died suddenly in 1483. His sons, young boys, were left behind. The older one was supposed to become king. But instead, their uncle took the crown. His name was Richard III. He locked the princes in the tower. And then, they disappeared. People whispered. Were they murdered? Silenced? Hidden? No one knew. But something had changed. The people began to turn against Richard. He was seen as a usurper, a child killer, a man who would do anything for power. Margaret saw her chance. She wasn't alone. Others wanted Richard gone. They wanted someone new. Someone with a claim, but also someone distant from all the blood and betrayal. That someone was her son, Henry Tudor. Margaret moved fast. She sent messengers. She made promises. She worked with Elizabeth Woodville, the queen of the dead King Edward IV. Together, they planned a marriage between Henry and Elizabeth's daughter. If it worked, Henry would unite the two warring houses, Lancaster and York, and end the war for good. But it was a dangerous plan. If Richard found out, Margaret could be killed for treason. He did find out. And he almost executed her. But Thomas Stanley, her husband, stepped in. He promised to keep her in line. Richard believed him, for a while. Margaret was placed under house arrest, watched, silenced, but she still found ways to send letters, to plan, to guide. She was still playing the game, carefully, quietly. Everything she had done, every step, every marriage, every alliance, was leading to one moment: the return of her son. Henry Tudor, now a grown man, landed in England in 1485 with a small army. It wasn't strong. It wasn't impressive. But Margaret had built something stronger than swords. She had built a cause. Men joined her son. Enemies of Richard rose up. Even Thomas Stanley, Margaret's husband, turned his back on the king. At the Battle of Bosworth, it ended. Richard III died on the battlefield. Henry Tudor became King Henry VII. And Margaret Beaufort, once a child bride, a widow, a forgotten mother, was now the mother of the king. The world that had crushed her was now in her hands. But her story wasn't over. Because power, once gained, must be kept. And Margaret knew better than anyone how quickly it could be lost. Henry Tudor was now king. The crown sat on his head, but his mother's hands had helped place it there. Margaret Beaufort had waited her entire life for this moment. Through war, marriage, betrayal, and loss, she had survived. Now, at last, her son ruled England. But she wasn't ready to fade into the background. In fact, she was just getting started. She was no longer just Lady Margaret. She became My Lady the King's Mother, a title created just for her. No woman had ever held that position before, and no woman had ever used it the way she would. She didn't sit quietly at court. She didn't spend her days sewing or praying. Margaret was involved in everything: politics, finances, law, and royal planning. She signed her letters as Margaret R., as if she were royalty herself. R stood for Regina, Latin for queen. But she was never queen. Not officially. And yet, she acted like one. She shared authority with her son. In some cases, she even outranked the queen, Elizabeth of York, the woman Henry married to unite the warring families. Margaret walked beside the king at public events. She wore royal clothes. She had her own rooms in every palace. her own staff, her own court. Nothing happened without her knowing. She managed royal finances. She advised on laws. She made sure her son stayed in power. And if someone crossed him, or crossed her, they would regret it. Margaret had learned to move in silence. But now, she moved openly, carefully, powerfully. She helped shape the new Tudor court, what it stood for, how it worked, and who belonged in it. She watched over her son's decisions, guided his thinking, and sometimes overruled his judgment. Henry trusted her completely. After all, she had raised him, not with bedtime stories, but with vision. She had told him for years that he was meant to rule. Now that he did, she wasn't going to let him fall. And Henry needed her. Ruling England wasn't easy. The country was still broken after years of civil war. Many nobles didn't trust the new king. Some still wanted a York on the throne. Rebellions rose. Rumors spread. Enemies waited. Margaret stepped in behind the scenes. She helped organize the royal marriage between Henry and Elizabeth of York, turning their wedding into a symbol of peace. She helped write laws that would punish traitors and protect her son's claim. She even helped raise their children, especially the eldest, Prince Arthur, and the future Henry VIII. Margaret believed in shaping the next generation from the start. She had seen what power could do. She wanted to make sure her family kept it. But she also never forgot her faith. Margaret was deeply religious. She believed her rise had been guided by God, that her suffering had a purpose. She built churches, donated to schools, founded colleges at Cambridge. She believed knowledge was power, and faith was survival. Still, she never fully let go of control. Even as she aged, Margaret stayed close to the king. She was his advisor, his shield, his silent shadow. Some at court whispered about her. They said she was too powerful, that she pushed the queen aside, that she meddled in affairs that weren't hers. But no one dared challenge her, because Margaret had something more powerful than fear. She had loyalty, respect, and results. Every move she made had worked. She had taken a child born in danger and turned him into a king. She had helped end a war that had lasted for decades. She had built a new royal family from the ashes of the old. And she had done it all without wearing a crown. It's easy to forget her in the grand story of the Tudors. Most people talk about Henry VIII and his 6 wives, or Elizabeth I and the Golden Age. But without Margaret, there would be no Tudor dynasty, no royal line, no legacy. She wasn't just a mother. She was the architect. She held the strings others couldn't see. And in her quiet, steady way, she reshaped England. But power always has a cost. As her son aged, so did she. Margaret saw how quickly things could change. She had played the game well, but games don't last forever. Henry VII ruled for over 20 years. When he died in 1509, his son, Henry VIII, took the throne. Margaret didn't live to see his reign. She died just 2 months after her son's death, at age 66. She had outlived 3 husbands, dozens of kings and lords, and the bloodiest war England had ever seen. But in the end, she left something behind. Not just a son, not just a crown, but a legacy. A reminder that history isn't always shaped by swords or speeches. Sometimes, it's shaped by silence, by patience, by pain. Margaret Beaufort was once a child bride, forced into motherhood, nearly broken by the world. But she didn't break. She rose. And she ruled, quietly, powerfully, completely. When Margaret's son Henry landed on English soil in 1485, the winds of destiny began to shift. She had spent decades weaving a web of support for his cause, forming quiet alliances, promising loyalty, and securing backdoor agreements. Her ambition wasn't selfish. It was survival. It was justice, for the pain, for the silence, for all the years she had played the game from the shadows. The Battle of Bosworth was brief, but it changed everything. Richard III fell. Henry Tudor was crowned king. And Margaret? She didn't vanish into the background. She stepped forward. For the first time, her power was open. She signed documents as My Lady the King's mother. She took control of royal finances. She helped arrange marriages, draft laws, and even ruled when Henry was away. She wore no crown, but everyone knew she held it up, Her trauma had not made her weaker. It had made her sharper, smarter, and more dangerous. Every scar she carried became a weapon. And now, at last, the girl who had once bled alone in the dark halls of a castle stood at the heart of a throne built with her own pain. Margaret Beaufort didn't die a queen. She didn't lead armies or rule a country by name. But when she passed away in 1509, just 2 months after her son Henry VII, she left behind a world she had reshaped. Her grandson, Henry VIII, was now king. Her blood flowed in the veins of every Tudor that followed. But her legacy went deeper than that. She had carved a place for herself in a world that tried to silence her. She had turned grief into purpose. She had turned pain into power. And yet, history remembers her only in pieces. As a pious woman, a strict mother, a political force behind the scenes. But behind all of those titles was a 12-year-old girl who never had a choice. A child forced to become a mother. A survivor who learned to play the long game. She never forgot the cost. She carried it in every decision, every silence, every careful move. So, was the Tudor dynasty built on the abuse of a child? Yes. But that child outlived the men who used her. She rose higher than any of them dreamed. And in the end, she didn't just survive history, she made it. History often remembers kings, battles, and crowns. But hidden behind every throne is a story of survival, of someone who refused to be broken. Lady Margaret Beaufort was never meant to rule. She was meant to be used, discarded, and forgotten. But she didn't just endure, she shaped a dynasty. If this story moved you, imagine how many more remain buried, waiting to be uncovered. So, if you enjoy untold stories, dark history, and powerful truths, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. And let me ask you this, do you believe Lady Margaret was a hero, or just another player in a brutal game? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every one of them. Thanks for watching. See you in the next story.